welcome back. I'm Savalian. I make videos about games development and creativity, and today we're going to talk about Valheim, a game that is a lot more popular and relevant than I realized. Valheim is a survival game, and it's a pretty straightforward survival game at that. There aren't really any gimmicks or twists, you're just a Viking trying to survive. There are some bosses to kill, but really you just want to keep unlocking new things to build that will help you survive better. Before last December, I was not really interested in Valheim at all. I'm not really into playing survival games. I played hundreds of hours of Ark, and after that, I wasn't really interested in playing survival games that didn't let you tame dinosaurs. I just really love creature collection, you know? And before you ask, yes, I am playing Pal World, and I'm having a lot of fun. This video is not going to be about Pal World, but I have been streaming it over on Twitch if you want to catch me there. So I wasn't interested in Valheim. It wasn't even on my radar or my wish list or anything. But then my partner, who also streams on Twitch under the name Tisferatu, decided to co-host a Valheim community server with a few other streamers, and I thought it might be nice first to play a game with him and also just to play a multiplayer game for once. I typically go single player pretty much all the time, so I thought it would be nice to get out of my comfort zone a little bit and play a game with other people. I ended up playing way more Valheim than I planned to. Over 100 hours in the first 3 weeks, which actually puts it at my 4th most played Steam game. It's kind of a surprise. And as much Valheim as I played, I did have a lot of complaints. It's kind of painful to play, you know? Stick with me on this one, diehard Valheim fans. It's pretty painful to play, but I think there's a lot of potential there. And there are a lot of things that the game really does well, which I think is why it's still so popular. But I think there are a lot of game design decisions and also a couple of technical decisions that could be changed to make the game a little bit more fun and create a more universally enjoyable experience. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what those pain points were for me, and in some cases how I would go about fixing them. And an important note before we begin, I played on a lightly modded server, and since I haven't played Valheim before this, I'm not totally sure what is vanilla and what is modded, so keep that in mind before you come at me in the comments. So I went into Valheim as a complete beginner, but I had a little bit of guidance. I have played survival games before, so some of this was familiar. There were a couple of other people who all set up their houses before, like hours before I started playing. I picked a spot kind of near them and started building. With my limited Valheim knowledge, I went into the game with one simple goal. I knew you could tame the boars, so I wanted to set up a farm for boars. And after a while, my partner and I started planning out like specific progression goals, but at first that's literally all I wanted to do. I wanted to build a house, get some boars, and then I figured I would probably get bored and stop playing. And here's where I'll say that I do not think this game is very kind to beginners. And then I also think they've made a lot of choices to make the game more tedious without necessarily making it more fun, which I will talk about. And these kinds of problems are very typical for survival games. It's not just Valheim. Whenever you have a complex resource gathering and crafting system, and you want it to feel real and you don't want to have to do a big info dump, you have to communicate to the player somehow how this system works. And in order to introduce a sort of tension and challenge, they also want you to earn it and discover this information by making an effort to discover it. And after thinking and talking and ranting about Valheim for several weeks now, I've narrowed down my main complaints to 3 areas: exploration, realism, and the multiplayer experience, specifically with how it relates to dedicated servers. So the first game design quandary, exploration and how it is balanced against consequences. Valheim wants you to explore. This is clear. They want you to explore, they want you to figure things out, and they don't want to make it too easy because they want the game to be a fun challenge. And one of the ways they encourage exploration is with the crafting system. In order to unlock crafting recipes, you have to collect the ingredients for that recipe, and then it will automatically unlock. And they introduced this to the player pretty early, so you know from the beginning, if you want to progress, you're going to need to leave your comfort zone, look for new resources, new mob drops, new items, and that's going to be how you get better and how you unlock everything you can unlock. I personally don't love this system because it makes it very hard for me to know what is possible in the future. If you haven't played Valheim before, you'd have no idea what an end game build looks like. You don't know what kind of crafting stations, how much space you're going to need. You don't know if you should really put a lot of effort into like your first house, if you're going to just have to knock it down and rebuild it with a new material. So I don't love that. I also just really don't like it when you kind of have to read a bunch of wikis to figure out how to play a game. But it is one way to do an exploration-based crafting system. And I think one way you could sort of compromise here is to show the items you can craft, but hide the ingredients, and then keep the mechanic where you have to find those ingredients to actually craft it. Because then at least you have an idea of what is possible, and you have something to look forward to. But they use the promise of new crafting recipes and new opportunities to encourage the player to explore. But if the player explores too far, or if they go somewhere unprepared, or if they just have some bad luck, they face consequences. And the main consequence in Valheim is, of course, death. Ew. Oh, whoops, I forgot to eat food. And I think they were just a little too harsh with death in Valheim. And before you just tell me to get good, hear me out. When you die in Valheim, you drop all of your stuff at the location you died at, and then you also lose some of your skills. I think it's 5% of your skills. So you have none of your equipment, and you are slightly less powerful than you just were. All the food, weapons, armor that you spent time building up to is at your body. If you died in a new area where you were facing like really difficult enemies, maybe you didn't know going into that area what to expect, and so you just got stomped by some new kind of enemy. And this is where the game gets really punishing if you're playing solo, or if you are playing with other people but there's no one around to help you when you die. Because just because you got there with all your items does not mean you can get there again without your items and your skills. Even if there wasn't that 5% decay, your base skills are not enough to make up for a lack of armor and lack of weapons. And some of the armor and weapons, you need highly advanced materials to make. So you can't just make more armor if you die, if you don't have a bunch of extra resources to make that armor with. And so you want to get back to your body and reclaim your items, but they've taken away everything that you used to get to that point. And so it's really hard. And if you just can't get back to your body, you have to sort of build up from scratch. You have to take a step back, get what you need to craft new armor, build up slowly, and then maybe then you can get back to where you were. Introduce another aspect of exploration, physically traveling across the game world. Valheim is about Vikings known for traveling by boat. Now, I'm not the best student of history, but I always think of Vikings as rowing their boats. But in Valheim, it's all sailing, 100% sailing. You can technically paddle, but it's just a little paddle, and it's very slow, and it does not counteract the wind really at all. So you rely on the winds to get around, and the map is mostly islands. And of course, all the cool stuff is not going to be on the starting island. You have to go out by boat to find all this new stuff and the new biomes so that you can progress in the game. And every single time we set out on a boat, the wind would start blowing in the opposite direction. It's supposedly random, but it was every single time. We would leave on the boat and it would slow to a crawl immediately. And even if you have the knowledge to angle the boat against the wind, tacking or whatever, the boats are very slow, and this is very tedious to do, this back and forth kind of thing. You end up both going farther than you need to, and it takes longer. And even the boats that require a lot of resources to build, I think the nice boat takes like 100 iron nails that of course sink to the bottom of the ocean if you crash the boat. Even those boats are pretty slow if the wind is not exactly aligned with your sails. And this system kind of ties into the issue of like realism versus convenience, which I'll talk about next. But it means that if you die on an island away from your home, you may have to build a whole new boat to slowly sail back out to where you were. And if you don't have the armor or weapons to survive when you get there, this can become like a sort of never-ending loop where you're just repeatedly making boats just to die again. And then on top of it, the sailing itself is fairly dangerous. There's serpents, there's storms, there's a couple of flying creatures that might be able to pick you off as you're going past an island. So these consequences really start stacking up, and all of it was sort of triggered by, one death, one little bit of bad luck, one time that you dared to explore maybe a little bit farther than you were prepared to go. And if you don't have the resources for a portal yet, you just have to figure it out. Like, there's no backup plan. You can't take like a durability hit to get all your stuff spawned back at your base. You're just kind of screwed. And I think it feels a little bit backwards to build literally the entire game around exploration and then have such harsh consequences for if you get a little bit too confident with that exploration. And then it also ties into some of the multiplayer challenges that I'll talk about later in this video, where if you want to really mitigate the consequences of exploration, you need to build portals. And the portals require a resource that is pretty limited on multiplayer servers. So we'll talk about that too. So you have this game that encourages you to explore, makes it very risky to actually do the exploring, and there's not really a very good indicator for where you're supposed to be and what you're able to fight at a certain level. For example, the wolves in the mountain biome hit like trucks. They are very strong. They are as strong as the trolls, but they travel in packs, so it's a little bit worse. But they're really small. They're kind of hard to see. They don't make a lot of noise to warn you away from them. So the only way to learn that wolves have, the same attack power as a troll is to go into the mountains and figure it out the hard way, potentially getting you into that sort of death loop where you're unable to retrieve your items because you happened to die somewhere a little bit far away from home. So I think there has to be a balance here, and currently I think the balance is skewed a little bit too much toward punishment for an action that the game is really encouraging you to do. For me, there were a couple of specific situations where I died so many times in a row and became so hopeless that if I did not have a much stronger player that I could beg for help, I would have 100% rage quit the game because it wasn't fun to do that. So I don't think that's a great experience, but you can judge it for yourself. The next category of thoughts is around realism versus convenience. So a lot of games, especially survival games, really like to model the world realistically because it adds to the challenge, and some players really like that. It gives you a lot of little things you can do that feel interesting. Project Zomboid, for example, is really, really heavy on its realism, and that's kind of one of the goals that the game has determined for itself, is to make it very realistic. But whenever you add realism, you reduce the convenience of whatever it is the player is trying to do. Imagine that every time you wanted to start a fire in a video game, you had to create the exact combination of friction and fuel and oxygen that you would need to start a real fire. There would be no point to playing a lot of video games if they were exactly one-to-one representations of real life, so you have another balance that you need to figure out. And Valheim sits somewhere in between, like a sort of very convenient game and like Project Zomboid, which goes super heavy on the realism. It has a lot of features that seem to be entirely for the sake of realism, and some of them add to the game and make it a little bit more interesting, and I think some of them just make the game more tedious to play. I already mentioned the sailing, which in my experience was a lot more trouble than it was worth. I think if the wind was more forgiving, or if the boat could be properly rowed, like a lot of what I think of when I see a Viking boat. I think it would have been more bearable, but as it was, the realism was extremely frustrating, and it felt like it was actually working against the players a lot of the time. And it would have been even worse if we had water force damage turned on. If you hit a wave a certain way, or if you're caught in a storm in Valheim, on the default settings, it can destroy your boat. We had a couple people who lost boats because the server was like not synchronized properly, and it caused the force damage and broke their boats. So because of that, we had that turned off. And we'll talk more about server issues later too. But it's just another thing where it's kind of like, yes, maybe this is realistic, but do we really want to have to deal with this on top of all the other things we're trying to deal with? Maybe not. Another way I think realism kind of interfered with the gameplay is with the ore and the metal ingots. And in order to, I think, preserve the progression of the game, Valheim does not let you take ore or metal ingots through certain portals. You have to unlock nicer portals before you can start taking the ore through them. And I think that's fine. I think it's fine to put limiters like that for the sake of progression and to encourage, doing things in a certain way that leads the player to slowly get more stronger. I think that's totally fine. But in addition to the portal limitations, they also made the metals very heavy, which is, realistic. Metal is heavy. But they made it so that you really can't carry very much of it on your person, but you also can't transport it. So you have to carry it, or you have to use a cart, something like that. And then they also made the act of mining alert all the enemies in the area to come and attack you. And they gave the tools a durability after, they'll break and they'll have to be repaired. So a lot of these things make sense in terms of realism, right? Metal's heavy, tools would break if you repeatedly hit them against a rock. Mining is pretty loud and it makes a sound. And a real person probably couldn't carry 300 pounds of metal 10 miles through a hilly forest. But I think enforcing a lot of these real things, all it does is serve to make mining a very tedious experience. And they do have some things that you can use to make it a little bit easier. There's a cart. By default, the cart does take damage, and that can be really rough to deal with because there's enemies everywhere. We had cart damage turned off as well, just to make the multiplayer experience a little bit less painful. But even with the cart, it really couldn't navigate the terrain very well. It would get stuck on like every single thing on the ground. If you dared to try and mine silver in the mountains, you had to basically terraform your way up and down the hill because there's a lot of rock in the way. There's a lot of little cliff sides and things that you just couldn't get the cart up and down. So many times it was not worth it to use the cart, or you couldn't reach it with a boat. The boat was too far away or something like that. So you ended up having a group of, 3 people running back and forth up and down the mountain to carry metal, to repair pickaxes, to run back after you got killed by a golem, to go get the cart. It was just a lot of chores, basically. And I think sometimes chores in video games are fun. I really like the repetition of mining. I think it's very relaxing. But I think with this system, if some of the convenience of video games was added back in, I think you could still make mining a fun, slightly dangerous little expedition that you go on, but maybe you don't force the players to make 5 trips to mine one node, or, spend an hour slowly hitting the ground with the mining pick so that the cart can get down the mountain. I think there's a lot of ways that they can make the process more streamlined without taking out some of the challenge of it. There are a lot of other little things that I'm not going to ramble about individually, but we'll just do a little speed round. The smoke buildup inside buildings, I think, is neat, but I wish that they would warn you about it because it's kind of unusual for a survival game. It's very atypical, I would say. So I didn't even know it was a thing. I got around it completely by accident and learned about it later. The fact that animals you're hunting can smell you if the wind is blowing their direction, absolutely wild, in my opinion, unnecessary, especially when you take into account the fact that the server is laggy enough that these little details often get lost in that anyway. Anything taking damage from big waves, again, because the servers can be somewhat unreliable, which we'll talk about, anything that happens in response to very delicate like physics reactions, I think it doesn't really have a place in a game like this, because it's hard to keep that consistent in a multiplayer setting. Light sources requiring constant fuel. I always hate this in video games, and everyone does it. All it is creating just chores for the player to do. If you have something that is purely aesthetic, like a wall torch, just let us run them without having to refill them every other day. Like, please. I'm begging you. We actually did have a mod that stocked the torches automatically, so that was nice, but it's, it's 2024. Don't make us fill up torches with wood every day, please. The structural integrity limits, I think, are just a tiny bit too rigid at the default settings. I think it takes some of the fun out of doing big, cool builds if you have to put a bunch of pillars in the middle of it. Just let us build a little bigger. It's gonna be fine. I will add that I think trees falling on people and killing them is funny. They can keep that one. I think it adds to sort of the novelty of the game. I'm sure there's a lot of other things. I know I was constantly pointing out things that seemed to only be in the game to make it realistic and not to make it more fun. But these are the things that I sort of remember the most clearly. Now on to the last category of things that I wanted to talk about, the multiplayer balance and the design decisions around multiplayer. Officially, Valheim servers support 10 people maximum. We had modded it to allow up to 25, but typically we had between 5 and 15. 15 was kind of our maximum when it was very, very popular at the beginning. And then those people who are online would typically actually play either alone or in groups of like 2 to 4. And it became very clear right from the beginning that Valheim was not really designed to be used at its maximum multiplayer capacity. It wasn't really designed for 10 people. And then the capacity that we were using it at was a little bit higher than that. And some of these issues were technical, and some of the issues were game design problems. First, technical problems. Dedicated Valheim servers use a kind of weird combination of server processing and local processing. And the way it was described to me is that the server coordinates what's happening and sort of keeps track of the positions of things and inventories of storage items. And then when people log in, one player is assigned as the chunk master of their chunk of the world, and their PC actually handles processing like the things that are happening in that chunk of the world. And I don't fully understand which things are sort of processed where, but you can see the effects of this system, and it causes a lot of problems. The most notable was that anytime someone with a less powerful PC was the chunk master, there would be huge amounts of lag for everyone else, like really ungodly amounts of lag.
There.
Ooh, mushrooms. I need these for my piggies. Mushroom? Please? Please? The lag? There it goes. You would have to stand over some loot for like 30 full seconds before you picked it up. Enemies would like pop in and out of existence like several meters away from where they were before, and it was just really hard to play the game at all if someone with an old machine was assigned to be the chunk master. And the only way to fix it was first to understand that it worked this way, which if we hadn't known about it, all we would have been able to see is that the game is running poorly, and that's a bad user experience no matter how you slice it. But because we did know, we had learned a little bit about how the multiplayer works, we could either have the estimated chunk master, we could never know for sure who it was, we could just sort of guess based on what was happening. We would have them log out and back in, or run away into a different chunk and let someone with a more powerful machine stay there so that they could be handed off and they could be the chunk master. And sometimes that worked, but as everyone's moving around through the world, you get into different chunks and you return to other chunks, and it's a rough system, and I'm not totally sure why they designed it this way. And this lag would affect everything from loot, picking up loot, taking things in and out of storage, driving boats, driving carts, fighting enemies. It's a really bad system for a game like this, where even 1 second of lag can get you just destroyed by an enemy that you couldn't see. And then, like we mentioned earlier, you have to face the consequences of dying, even if it wasn't really your fault. Like, you were playing the game the best you could, and the lag hid the enemies from you. It feels very, very frustrating. It erodes the player's patience, and it was frequent enough that we were constantly sort of complaining about it. I think if instead you do most of the processing server side, if you have lag issues at that point, it could be an individual player's ping, or it could just be you need to make the server more powerful, which are both solutions that you can actually address, where the problems that we faced, we could only sort of guess at things that might help, and a lot of the times there was nothing we could do. And the other way we can look at multiplayer is in terms of game design. So these are all decisions made by the developers for how the game works that has repercussions for multiplayer. A fairly minor note to start, and one that you can mitigate with some communication, is that Valheim will send raids of enemies to players randomly, and there are some server settings to determine how these raids are figured out exactly, but depending on the settings, it can mean that one really advanced player can cause everyone else to have really scary, powerful enemies in a raid that can destroy everything that they have. And it's random. You can't really predict when it's going to happen, and you may not be near anyone else who can help you. And this makes it really hard to accept new players onto a server that has been going for a week or two, because everyone's sort of advanced in that time. And it also might mean that players who have a lot of time to play the game may need to actively wait until other people are ready, which can be frustrating to coordinate if you have some people with a lot of time and then some other people who don't have a lot of time. And this isn't unique to Valheim. This is a balancing issue that happens with a lot of multiplayer games, and there are different ways to approach the problem. But I just know it can be devastating when one player gets ahead of everyone else, and then someone who's still learning how to play the game gets their base leveled completely by a raid that they weren't prepared for. Even more of an issue is resource sharing in Valheim. There are a lot of items that you absolutely need to progress in Valheim, but they are only available in limited amounts on the map. And some of these things are queen bees, Surtling cores, at least until you can reliably get to a swamp, and then most importantly iron, which only spawns in some dungeons, and doesn't really spawn in nodes like the copper and the silver do. There is also a limited amount of most of the ores like copper, tin, and silver. There's a lot more of these than there is of iron, at least in my experience, so it's not quite as bad, but it becomes a problem if you have people who start playing after a lot of the other people have started playing, because the home island kind of gets stripped of all the good resources, and then the new people have to travel to other islands, but it's harder to travel to other islands because all you can really build with what's left is like the most basic raft. But a lot of these resources are really important, and they don't respawn. Once they're gone, they're gone. So the queen bees spawn in with some of the objects in the terrain. Once they're harvested, they're gone. You do need honey to make mead as a base for a lot of the defensive items in the game. You need it to go into the mountains. It's really, really useful for the swamp. Maybe you don't need it quite as badly there, but a lot of these things really limit you in progression if you don't get them early enough. The Surtling cores, which are found at lower levels, only inside dungeons, are required to make some of the crafting items that you need to get past that first little step in your crafting. And if all the dungeons are tapped out, you can only get them by finding a spawner in the swamp, and it's hard to do that. So all of these things can be managed if you have a close-knit server and everyone's cooperating, and you're really talking about who is gonna harvest what and how you're gonna share it. But that's hard to do, and someone has to sort of take control of managing that, and it removes some of the freedom of the players, and it makes just running around enjoying the game a little bit harder. I think it would be a lot more reasonable just to at least have an option available to allow things like bees and the surtling cores and the iron to respawn where they've spawned. I don't think, some people think that that would make the game too easy to farm. I think you've just really got to ask yourself, like, why are you playing this game? Are you playing it so you could be the only person in your group of 10 that has any iron? Or are you playing it to, play a fun game with your friends and help everyone advance and experience the late game? I think allowing people to earn resources that someone else has already gathered is perfectly fine. I don't know. What do you think? I do definitely think iron should be more widely available. I understand there's a mod that adds like iron nodes to the map. I don't really understand why the game doesn't just have like iron veins. Maybe they're working on it. I think it is still in early access, which I probably should have mentioned at the beginning. But iron is just so important. Everyone always needed more iron. But the swamps would just get farmed up. All the iron would be gone. You'd have to go farther and farther to find more swamp and find more iron. And it just got really tough to manage that with, 10 people or 15 people all trying to do the same content at the same time. And with all that rambling about what's wrong with the game, I'm going to wrap up with what I think is right about Valheim. For starters, I think the building system, while it is very tricky to figure out as a beginner, it's actually really fun. I would recommend turning the structural integrity up a little bit, just so you can have a little bit more freedom with your builds. I'm not really someone who likes building in games that much. I kind of do it so that I can progress with the adventure side of it. I like to play with the mechanics of the game and not so much the building. But I had a lot of fun with Valheim's building because it is very flexible. It allows you to do a lot of very unusual things. You can use some of the pieces in ways that they are obviously not intended for, but they give you a cool look or they let you make a neat shape. My favorite building hack is to use the ladders as skylights, which is an idea I stole from a YouTube video I saw once. But I always appreciate it when a building system has differently sized pieces, as well as like triangular pieces or rounded pieces that lets you customize how things look. Because even though there's a way that the pieces are intended to look, I really appreciate it when a game lets you use things for purely aesthetic reasons in a way that maybe it wasn't intended to be used, but it doesn't hurt anything by letting a player, use a roof as a floor or something like that. I always really like when there's at least some element of terraforming where you can raise or flatten terrain to make your house fit on it better. And Valheim does have that. Gold star for building in Valheim, with just a little asterisk because the way that you interact with the building system is a little bit quirky and it's really not very intuitive as a beginner. But once I figured it out, I had a lot of fun. I also really appreciate how big and varied the Valheim world is. There are a lot of different biomes, and I think the procedural generation is tuned really well because it allows for a somewhat linear progression. Not fully linear, but like you don't set out on your boat and immediately end up in endgame content. There's like a ring of biomes that slowly get more difficult, and I think it works really well with the way that they've set up their exploration. If only the sailing was less of a pain in the ass, then I think everything would really work together really well. And finally, I think Valheim has built up a nice little player base full of helpful and creative people. I had no idea until I started streaming Valheim and seeing people come into my chat because I was playing Valheim. I had no idea how many people there were who consider it among their favorite games and who are just excited to help new people play and share tips and share ideas and share little stories about ways that they've enjoyed the game or little adventures they've had. It's just really nice, and I had no idea that this like subsection of the gamer community even existed. There's also a thriving YouTube Valheim community that shares a lot of Valheim information, beginner guides, information about crafting, about the building system, information about mods, inspiration for cool builds, all kinds of things. There are so many ways to enjoy Valheim as part of that community, and I think it's really nice. I hope I didn't ruffle too many feathers with this one. I really did have a nice time playing Valheim, but as a game developer, I'm always looking for lessons I can learn and ways I can understand the mechanisms behind what makes games fun, what makes people want to play a game. So I had a lot of fun digging into my experience here and pulling out what I think those little lessons were. So that's all I have for today. So please like this video if you thought it was useful. Subscribe if you'd like to do that, because I will be back soon with another video, and I hope to see you there. Okay, bye-bye.